Stuart Fever is a professor of British history and chair of the Department of History at the University of Rochester in New York. He earned his BA in History and English at Duke University in 1979 and his MA and PhD in History at Stanford University in 1982 and 1985. His books include The Hammonds, A Marriage in History, Stanford University Press in 1977, and most recently, in collaboration with Maurice Iserman, Fallen Giants, A History of Himalayan Mountaineering from the Age of Empire to the Age of Extremes, from Yale University Press in 2008. His presentation this evening pulls information from that work, and he will be presenting that to us this evening. Stuart.
Thank you very much, Grace. I'm going to try to get this to be tall enough for me. I will some, but I also want to point some, and I have to flip the slides, and I only have two hands. I'll do my best. Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. Can you hear me? Am I close enough to this? Am I close enough to this microphone? I confess that when Grace first invited me for this return engagement, I hesitated to accept, thinking that it would be silly of me to come back and talk for a second time about this book. This is the book that she referred to, which I wrote with my friend Morris Sisserman. It's a history of Himalayan mountaineering from its beginnings in the late 19th century to the present. On the other hand, it is quite a big book, and there's quite a lot in it. So I thought that I could probably come back and talk about something other than what I talked about last time, although that would be easier if I could remember what I talked about last time. So I'm taking my chances here and hope that maybe there's no one here who was here last time, though perhaps that's improbable. Does anyone remember listening to me talk about this book before? That's not as many as I feared, so I think maybe I'll be okay. I think it's likely that what I talked about last time, talking about this book, was the story as a whole. I probably gave a talk that quickly recounted the history of Himalayan mountaineering, subject of the book obviously, from the late 19th century to the present, and I may have dwelled especially on the part of the story that got me interested in writing this book in the first place, and that was the story of the climbing of Everest, the successive British attempts on Everest, or Chomolungma, as we should properly say these days, in the 1920s. These were the climbs that famously featured the great English mountaineer George Lee Mallory, of Because It's Their fame, who died on Everest in 1924. This was an interest. I came to the history of Himalayan mountaineering by way of British history, by way of the history of India. I was very familiar with Mallory himself in other contexts, and this took me ultimately to Himalayan mountaineering. As I worked on this book, however, in the early 2000s, I found that the story that most interested me, really, was one that I had known nothing about before writing the book, and that was the story of the effort on the part of successive German expeditions between 1929 and 1935 to climb Nanga Parbat, the great massif at the northwestern extremity of the main Himalayan axis at 26,561 feet, the world's 9th highest mountain, which you see here in all of the images of Nanga Parbat, with one exception. All of the images of this great mountain that I'm in the Himalaya that I'm going to show you tonight are historic photographs from the German expeditions in the 1930s. A few earlier and one or two later. And I emphasize German here. These were German expeditions. Up until the 1960s and 70s, and this is a point that we emphasize in our book, Himalayan mountaineering was a stridently nationalist undertaking. Most of the expeditions that went to the Himalaya before the 1960s were nationally organized, and they were representative of national climbing clubs and establishments, and they were mostly government-sponsored. And one of the stories that we tell in our book is that of how certain peaks in the Himalaya came to be identified with specific national ambitions and national climbing establishments. So just as the British effectively laid claim to Everest in the 1920s, so the Italians laid claim to K2, the French laid claim to Annapurna, and so forth and so on. This is how it's sorted out, at least at first. But of all of these potent identifications of nation and mountain, of national psyche and mountaineering ambition, none of these was so powerful, arguably, as the German identification with Nanga Parbat. For a couple of reasons, because nowhere was nationalism so strident as it was in Germany in the 1930s, obviously. Mountaineering, this is the great DMR face of Nanga Parbat. Mountaineering intersected with the Nazi state, and it became part of the Nazi mission to demonstrate German superiority to the world, which explains in part why so many climbers died in the German effort to climb Nanga Parbat. And it gained its reputation as the world's great killer mountain, and this only added to its mystical allure where Germans and German mountaineers were concerned. The martyrdom of so many German mountaineers in the effort to climb this great mountain only added to the attraction to this deadly peak where the German mountaineering establishment was concerned. Though it's a long way from Germany, obviously, Nanga Parbat became, not just for those who climbed it, but for the Germans generally, who came to be very familiar with Nanga Parbat and its history, their Schicksalsberg, as they said, their mountain of destiny, the mountain on which German climbers repeatedly tried to redeem, as they saw it, the tarnished honor of their country, first unsuccessfully after the First World War, and then somewhat successfully after the Second. So what I want to do today simply is share this part of my book, which I hope is not something that I talked about last time. I think it's not. What I want to do is share the part of this book that deals with this remarkable story, the story of the German assault on Nanga Parbat. All right? That's all I've got by way of an introduction. So if anybody wants to really push for a talk on something else, I'll do my best. Okay, where are we? First of all, where are we? We are here. Nanga Parbat anchors the western Himalaya, both geologically and visually. It is the great western buttress of the entire Himalayan, 1,500-mile Himalayan range. This is an illustration from our book, by the way, which simply positions the Himalaya relative to the Indian subcontinent. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Himalaya, where the Himalaya is, the abode of snow. This is the great Everest Massif here. It's in the eastern Himalaya. Most books people read about the Himalaya are either about Everest in the eastern Himalaya or Annapurna in the central Nepal Himalaya. This is Nanda Devi, the highest peak in India, and Nanga Parbat, which is at the far western extremity of the Great Range. Whether Nanga Parbat is in India or whether it is in Pakistan very much depends upon whom you ask. It is in that region of Kashmir which is disputed by India and Pakistan. It falls on the Pakistani side of the United Nations line of control in this region, and most maps and international authorities recognize Nanga Parbat as being in the Gilgit-Baltistan region of Pakistan. It is a satellite image of the Himalaya. It is the pivot point, as I've said, of the great, geologically speaking, the Himalayan syntaxis. It is the point at which the Indian tectonic plate is colliding with the tectonic plate. It hits first at Nanga Parbat, and therefore, though Everest in the eastern Himalaya is, of course, the world's highest mountain, Nanga Parbat actually is the fastest rising. And if we live long enough, it's rising at about 5 centimeters per year, actually. And so if we live for, I don't know, a few 100,000 years, will live to see Nanga Parbat, the highest mountain in the world. It will be that. The Massif is best known for its, this is a German map of the Himalayas. It comes from one of the official expedition accounts that I'll be talking about, and I like it because it just sort of demonstrates sort of tectonically what's happening here. You can almost picture the leading edge of the Indian tectonic plate colliding with the great Tibetan shield, which results in the upthrust of the entire Himalayan range, and Nanga Parbat is right at the point of collision. This is a tectonically very active region, seismically very active region of India and Pakistan. Nanga Parbat viewed from the north. When viewed from the west, it rises, as here, it rises near sheer from the bed of the Indus River for 25,000 feet. Because this is a 23,000-foot face over a space of just a few miles, it's one of the great mountain walls. It's one of the great mountain walls in the world. Because Nanga Parbat is so far to the north and west of where their empire took hold in India, the British were very slow to discover it. It was not until 1835 that one very intrepid English traveler and spy, probably, one Godfrey Thomas Vine, crossed the Gurre Pass in Kashmir and stumbled unexpectedly on what he called, in his account of his travels, which you see in the second edition here, published in 1842, what he called the most awful and magnificent sight in all of the Himalaya, and this is what he would have been looking at. 23,000 feet of cliff-come ice leaping near sheer from the lifeless gorge of the Indus River. The stupendous peak of Nanga Parbat burst suddenly upon my sight, rising far above every other around it and entirely cased in snow, except where its scarps were too precipitous. It was partially encircled by a broad belt of cloud, and its finely pointed summit glistening in the full blaze of the morning sun, relieved by the clear blue sky beyond, presented an appearance of extreme altitude, and Vine guessed, in fact, that Nanga Parbat had to be what was, in his mind, the unimaginable height of perhaps 20,000 feet, which would have made it, 5,000 feet than any mountain in Europe in his experience. Of course, Nanga Parbat is considerably higher than that, at 26,661 feet. So, needless to say, Godfrey Thomas Vine had no thought of climbing it. Mountaineering was then in its infancy, even in the Alps, and it would be another half-century or more before anyone had any thought of climbing in the Himalaya. That, plus the fact that Nanga Parbat was very difficult of access in the perennially disturbed tribal regions of Kashmir, it was only very loosely within the British sphere of influence. And so it wasn't for a long time, it wasn't until 1895 that anyone had A, the nerve, and B, the permission to get into this region and attempt to climb Nanga Parbat. And the first man who did attempt to climb it was this great English climber here, Alfred Frederick Mummery, who went out with a very small team of Balti porters and fellow Englishmen in 1895. He was one of the best known, here with his daughter and wife, he was one of the best known climbers of his day. He was among the first to break from the English tradition of simply following in the footsteps of Swiss guides wherever they went in the Alps and attempting to climb the great alpine peaks for themselves. He was a leading advocate of guideless climbing, as well as climbing for its own unscientific and purely athletic sake, just because it's there, as Mallory would later say, but Mummery was an Englishman who climbed in very much the same spirit as Mallory. He was the son of a tradesman, which blocked his election to the gentlemanly enclave of the Alpine Club in London. But despite being the son of a tradesman, he was one of the great mountaineers of his day. And he was the first to venture out of the Alps and into the Caucasus Mountains, which he wrote about in 1895, the year he went out into the Himalaya, where he was one of the very first European climbers to venture. These are a couple of photographs. You don't see Nanga Parbat here very well, but these are a couple of photographs from the 1895 expedition itself that were taken by a fellow climber of Mummery's on Nanga Parbat, Norman Colley. I don't think there will be any serious mountaineering difficulties on Nanga. The peak is much freer from hanging glaciers than I had expected, Mummery wrote to his wife. I fancy the ascent will mainly be a question of endurance. But nothing in Mummery's experience in the Alps had prepared him for the scale of Himalayan climbing, and he greatly underestimated both the vertical and the lateral distances involved in climbing these mountains. You're all probably familiar with the well-known mountaineer's curse of the false summit, but you've never seen a series of false summits like people see in the Himalaya, and he simply had no really sense of the scale of what was above him. And also, thin air and climbing at these rarefied heights was still very little understood. We find Nanga a tough nut to crack, he wrote again to his wife as if in surprise. The way up is easy enough, but it's very difficult to get our camps fixed, and the air certainly does affect one. And after floundering about and these little marks of Norman Colley's on the photographs mark the highest point, you really can't see Nanga Parbat disappearing into the clouds above. This is the high point on the DMR face of Nanga Parbat that Mummery reached in 1895. After floundering about on the DMR face for 10 days or so, Mummery and two Gurkha companions died in an avalanche crossing this pass, having failed on the DMR face of Nanga Parbat, trying to cross this pass here to get to the north, the side from which the Germans would ultimately climb it. His was the first death of a Western climber in the history of Himalayan mountaineering, and it set a grisly precedent for Nanga Parbat. And after Mummery's death and failure on Nanga Parbat, the scene in the history of Himalayan mountaineering, and this I probably did talk about here last time, shifts to the Karakoram, the great western face of K2, which was the site of many early mountaineering efforts in the early 20th century, and then to Everest, the east face of Everest here, British expedition of 1922, the focus of much British mountaineering efforts all failed in the 1920s and 30s. Back in Europe, while the Italians were trying to climb K2 and the British were trying to climb Everest, back in Europe, the Germans were coming to the fore of alpine mountaineering. Or not the Germans generally, but rather a particular group of young German climbers associated with the Academic Alpine Club of the University of Munich, just north of the Bavarian Alps, who became collectively known in mountaineering circles in the 1920s and 1930s as the Munich School of Mountaineering, which signified a lot of things, but on a technical level, what it signified was an unrestrained commitment to innovation and to climbing hitherto unimaginable routes, the great north walls of the Alps. Traditionally, people climbed the great alpine mountains by their ridges, and it was the Germans in the 20s and 30s who took to climbing alpine mountains by their great north faces. You may have seen the gripping movie North Wall about one of these efforts to climb the north face of the Eiger in the 1930s. They were climbing mountains by novel, unimaginably difficult routes, by novel means, innovative means. It was the Germans, for instance, who first made use of the front-pointed crampon, which eliminated the need for laborious cutting of steps in the ice by ice axe. It was the Germans who first made use of the piton and the carabiner, those conjoined miracles of simple technology that made possible the placing of points of belay on an otherwise sheer mountain face. And these tools, together with pure Germanic determination, made possible the kind of direct assaults on the mountain faces or mountain walls for which the Munich School was best known. So not for them the tired or the well-worn mountain ridges. A new chapter in the history of mountaineering opened in August 1925 when two Bavarians, Vila Velzenbach and Joachim Alvine, climbed straight up the north face of the Dent des Rangs in under 16 hours. Paul Bauer, a representative Munich climber and one of the first to lead expeditions into the Himalaya. But there was always more to what English traditionalists derided as the dangle and whack school. After the hammer and piton, and wrote the dangle and whack school, the technical innovation on audacity. In fact, school is not really the right word to describe what was really a climbing fraternity founded on the common experience of national defeat and marked, as one of them said, Paul Bauer, whom you see here, by a stern, warlike, disciplined spirit, which was our heritage from the Great War. Most of the members of the Munich Climbing Club were veterans of the Great War, and many of them were deeply scarred by the experience. They were traumatized by battle. They were disoriented by the defeat. In 1918, they were drawn, as many German veterans were, especially in Munich, to the many reactionary political factions that, of course, plagued the short, unhappy history of the Weimar Republic, of which Hitler's National Socialist Party, which was especially strong in Munich, was just one. Their main consolation was climbing in a close company of fellows. And from Munich, where, if you've been to Munich, you know the Bavarian Alps constantly beckon on the southern horizon, Sunday after Sunday, from the time of the hyperinflation of 1922-23 to the Great Depression of 1929 and the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, Paul Bauer, see here, and his friends would flee the sound and fury of the city for the Bavarian Alps. It was imperative for us, Bauer later wrote, to escape from the crushing narrowness into which Germany had been forced by the war. And when the Bavarian Alps could no longer satisfy either their mountaineering ambition or their escapist urge, they roamed farther afield, first to Italy and Switzerland and France, finally the Caucasus, finally the Pamirs, and finally the Himalaya. Where in 1929, Paul Bauer, whom you saw here in the previous slide, in 1929, Paul Bauer and some of his comrades, with Sherpa support, reached 22,228 feet on the great peak of Kanchenjunga on the border of Indian Sikkim and Nepal, on what is still to this day known as the Bauer Spur, on the great eastern flank of Kanchenjunga, the world's highest mountain. They reached 22,200 feet on the Bauer Spur before a violent blizzard forced them into a memorable, death-defying retreat. Paul Bauer and his Munich climbing companions returned once again, of course, as always, with Sherpa support to Kanchenjunga in 1931 and reached 25,500 feet on the northeast spur, a scant mile from the mountain's summit, before fresh snow and the risk of avalanche forced their retreat. Meanwhile, Paul Bauer's compatriot, fellow Bavarian, fellow Munich Academic Climbing Club member, and one-time climbing partner, Vila Velzenbach, who was famous along with another University of Munich Alpine Club climber, Willy Merkel, famous for a death-defying ascent of the north face of the Grand Chamois, an ice-clad granite wall that rises 3,600 feet above the Mer de Glace in the Chamonix Valley. And he had developed his own independent Himalayan ambitions. and a kind of rivalry set in between the great German climber Paul Bauer, who was intent on Kanchenjunga, and the great German climber Vilo Welzenbach, once his friend, who was intent on Nanga Parbat. He settled on Nanga Parbat as the one available 8,000-meter peak that offered a reasonable chance of success. Here's Nanga Parbat on a 1909 Indian gazetteer map of the Northwest Frontier Province in Kashmir. You see Kashmir in yellow, which signifies on all these old British imperial maps that it was not, strictly speaking, within the British Indian Empire. The Northwest Frontier Provinces, which you see here in red, were part of the Crown Colony of British India, but Kashmir was not. And lying where it did, where three empires converge, as was often said, the British Indian Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Russian Empire, where three empires converged. This was traditionally, always, persistently, a politically troubled region, not just where three great imperial rivalries were playing out, where India abutted on Central Asia, but where unsubdued native indigenous people, tribal populations, were resisting anybody's political authority. And needless to say, it's topographically a more broken territory than you can possibly imagine just by looking on a map. And here in the middle of it all sits the great Western Himalayan massif of Nanga Parbat. Nevertheless, Vilo Welzenbach had settled on Nanga Parbat as a peak that offered, he thought, a reasonable chance of success. In the 37 years since Mummery had vanished on the DMR face of Nanga Parbat, few Europeans had so much as approached it, though it is only 80 miles north of Srinagar, in the Vale of Kashmir. Though it's only 80 miles north of Srinagar, it bordered on the perennially troubled districts of Gilgit and Baltistan, and British authorities were very reluctant to grant access. For a German especially, to get permission from the British took some doing, and by the time Welzenbach had done so in 1932, the Weimar Republic was, of course, in its death throes. Germany was beset by political and economic crisis, and the Munich City Council decided that it could not dispense with its civil engineer, who was Vilo Welzenbach, and denied him permission to leave Germany. So the honor, and such it was construed, needless to say, the honor of leading the first German expedition to Nanga Parbat thus fell to his compatriot and sometime climbing partner, Willy Merkel. And it is in his memoirs, Willy Merkel's memoirs, of the 1932 German expedition to Nanga Parbat, that we begin to sense the spell that Nanga Parbat was to cast over the German psyche. Here, for instance, is Merkel, recalling his expedition's discovery of the famous Märchenwiese, the Fairy Meadow, that lies at the foot of the Reykjavik Glacier along the upper Indus, just to the north of Nanga Parbat. This is a very washed out photograph, I know, but this is from the 1932 expedition. And I'll just share with you a portion of Willy Merkel's climbing memoir of the 1932 expedition, in which he is describing his teams coming upon the Märchenwiese, the Fairy Meadow, at the foot of Nanga Parbat. After a short way along the path, the Fairy Meadow opened up before us. It lies there in sublime charm among the light green of the pasture, covered with the stars of the Edelweiss and embraced by the trunks of ancient timber forests, just like a corner of undestroyed paradise. The fabulous meadow appeared to us above the glacier beneath the towering, ice-clad northern flank of Nanga Parbat. Astonishing. Here at 3,000 meters high above the glaciers stood an ancient timber forest with mighty fir trees and glowing birches. As we gazed on it, we felt deeply the kinship with the mountains of our homeland. He uses the resonant German word Heimat, the mountains of our Heimat. Only here, the feelings and impressions of the Alps were magnified in the unimaginable massiveness of the Himalaya, homeland of the Indo-Germanic peoples who were born in these mountains and fell under their power. Here we raised our base camp, and to the strains of Dear Homeland, we greet you. We cut into our first Bavarian ham, a memorable occasion that even the unrestrained picking of the Edelweiss by our Saxon comrade, Felix Simon, could not diminish. There are a number of interesting things about this passage, to me. But the most interesting is the identification of Kashmir and the American Visa, the Fairy Meadow, as the homeland of the Indo-Germanic peoples. The Germans had no colonial standing in India, but they, above all others, became obsessed, of course, in the 1930s with the alleged Aryan origin of Indo-European civilization. So much so that in 1939, Heinrich Himmler would dispatch a pseudo-scientific expedition under Ernst Schaeffer to Tibet to find evidence of the Germans' wayward kin. German mountaineers came to the Himalaya by way of the Caucasus, the original dispersal point of the Aryan peoples in Germanic imagination. And in their minds, they somehow elided these two Eurasian ranges, and they claimed both the Caucasus and the Kashmiri Himalaya as their ancestral own, Never mind that no one had died yet, or not one single German had yet to set foot on the mountain, or that 5 more expeditions were to follow before a German climber finally reached the summit. Here in the Fairy Meadow in 1932, Nanga Parbat had already cast her spell and caught these heartsick, homesick Germans in a death embrace. The American Visa, the north face of Nanga Parbat. This may be the point at which to pause and describe the somewhat tortuous and circuitous route by which the Germans had decided to climb this mountain. While the Germans were famous already for climbing the north walls of Alpine mountains, no one as yet had any thought of trying to attempt to climb a mountain wall in the Himalaya. So what this meant was, and this is an illustration from our book, a very long, tortuously long, roundabout, circuitous route up the Reykjavik Glacier toward South Chongra Peak and the col between the Chongra Peak and the outlying Reykjavik Peak, up along this long snow arête leading to the Silver Saddle, the summit plateau, the north summit of Nanga Parbat, and ultimately, they hoped, the ultimate summit of Nanga Parbat. An illustration from one of the German climbing accounts perhaps gives you a better sense of the route that they were attempting on Nanga Parbat in the 1930s. Their base camp, the various camps along the way, the Reykjavik Peak, the snow arête up to the Silver Saddle, the summit plateau, the North Peak, the summit itself, which you can't see here behind the north summit of Nanga Parbat. The 1932 effort to climb Nanga Parbat expired here at Camp 5 between the Reykjavik Peak and the Silver Saddle. About 2 miles and 3,600 vertical feet away from the summit of Nanga Parbat itself. It was not bad under the circumstances, but it was not enough to satisfy German honor or German ambition, and so it was certain that Willy Merkel would be determined to return. The Nazi seizure of power in the following year momentarily threw everything into confusion, while the German climbing establishment was purged of all undesirable elements and brought into line with the new political dispensation of the Third Reich. At the same time, the Nazi seizure of power upped the ante considerably. It made it all the more important for the Germans to prove their mettle, as they understood it, against the decadent English, and steal the prize, which was still out there waiting to be stolen, to steal the prize of the first ascent of an 8,000-meter peak. The Reich sports minister, Hans von Schönbrunn-Osten, badly wanted a Himalayan boast for his boss, Adolf Hitler. He wanted one of the great Himalayan peaks for Führer and fatherland. And by 1934, the new expedition was underway, though it still, of course, took British permission to get into this troubled region. And so the 1934 expedition set out under the weirdly combined sponsorship of the Nazi dictatorship and the government of the British Indian Empire. So almost always you'll see in these expedition photographs, this is Fritz Bechtold, who wrote the official expedition account of the 1934 expedition. This is on ship on the way to Karachi. He has here an inspiring photo of the American Visa and Nanga Parbat on his ship cabin wall, and the two flags, the Union Jack and the Nazi swastika, sort of signaling the weirdly combined sponsorship of these German expeditions. A German climbing expedition that had to pay all due respect to the British Indian Empire in order to get access to the mountain. The 1934, and here you see the German climbers, and once again they would have been supported by an elite corps of Sherpa climbers, up to 20 of them, and hundreds of porters from Baltistan. The 1934 expedition attempted to climb Nanga Parbat by the same route as in 1932, but the snow line fell considerably lower on the mountain than it had in 1932, and this complicated the business of route finding and enforced the placing of more intermediate camps. Tragedy struck initially when on June 8, one of the German climbers, Alfred Drexel, died of high-altitude pulmonary edema, a familiar condition in climbing, a swelling in the lungs, which is then not understood. Caused by high altitude, climbing too rapidly at high altitude, still not very well understood. Drexel was buried. This is his burial ceremony. He was buried in a Nazi flag on a rounded glacial moraine above base camp with due ceremony, but the effect of this death was to set the expedition back for 10 days, which happened to be 10 perfectly clear days. The best chance for the summit had been lost. Vila Velzenbach was having his doubts. The expedition is too large and cumbersome, he wrote to his parents. In it, there are several camp followers who are only a burden on the advance because they require porters and food and tents. These men are of no use to the expedition, but all the same, they all want to go to the summit. You can't hope to take a party of 10 to 12 men up an 8,000-meter peak. The result will be that nobody gets to the top. Prescient words, and in fact the result was to prove far worse. By early July, the stage was set for a perfect disaster when 19 men, 6 Germans and 13 Sherpas were high on the mountain, effectively cut off from support below and still separated from the summit by a much greater, you can't see the summit here, it's far, somewhere over here. Still separated from the summit by a far greater lateral distance than they knew. Left to themselves, 2 particularly strong climbers, Erwin Schneider and Peter Aschenbrenner, may well have made the summit in July of 1934, but Merkel was set on a group pilgrimage. This was part of the ethic of comradeship and collaboration and community, the Mannschaft of the expedition. He was set on a group pilgrimage whereby everyone would make it to the summit, and this simply slowed the effort down. This is far too many people to have at a high camp on a Himalayan peak, although it's now quite routine on Everest. It's a dangerous situation in those days on a mountain like Nanga Parbat. Storm struck on July 6, and when it refused to abate, Merkel ordered a general retreat that for sheer protracted agony has no parallel in mountaineering history. So here, if you'll indulge me, this is how I describe this retreat in the book itself. Do you want to hear it? The plan called for the 2 strongest climbers, Schneider and Aschenbrenner, to lead down the mountain with Pasang, Nima Dorje, and Pinzo Nurbu. Merkel, Velzenbach, and Wieland would follow close behind with the 8 remaining Sherpas. All moved off in good order, leaving some tents and sleeping bags behind in hopes of return. But the storm continued unabated, and with visibility down to a dozen yards, the 2 groups became separated. On reaching easy ground above Camp 7, Aschenbrenner and Schneider unroped and carried on independently all the way to Camp 4, where they assured an astonished and worried Bechtold that the others would arrive at any moment. But in fact, the others were unimaginably far behind, strung out along the Reykjavik Ridge in various states of desperation. Once unroped, Passang, Nima Dorje, and Pinzo Norbu made it no farther than Camp 7, where they spent a harrowing night with no food or drink and one sleeping bag between them. Merkel, Velsenbach, Wieland, and their 8 Sherpas fared even worse, collapsed in a bivouac between Camps 8 and 7, with 3 sleeping bags between them. And there Nima Norbu died, sometime on the night of July 8. The next morning, July 9, Angsering, Gele, and Dakshi stayed at the bivouac, too ill, they said, to continue. Velsenbach, Merkel, Wieland, and 4 other Sherpas left without them for Camp 7, where they found neither food, bedding, nor fuel. Wieland died 100 feet from the camp tent. Merkel and Velsenbach, now utterly spent and insensible, sent Kitar, Passang Kakuli, Nima Tashi, and Don Thundu on to Camp 6 in hopes of finding help. But the 4 lost their way and spent the night in a snow cave. Meanwhile, the 3 abandoned Sherpas had left Camp 7 for Camp 6, but they too failed to find it in the swirling snow and sheltered in an ice cave on the ridge. The next morning, they converged on the difficult traverse of the Reykjavik peak. Nima Dorje and Nima Tashi died in the fixed ropes above Camp 5. Pinzo Norbu died 6 feet short of the tent. The 4 frostbitten survivors staggered into the safety of Camp 4 in the late afternoon of July 10, which is what you see here. Up above, 5 men were still clinging to their lives. None of them moved at all on July 10. Dakshi died sometime that night. Angsering and Gele moved down to Camp 7, where they found Merkel and Velsenbach alive, but in extremis. Merkel in a hypoxic stupor, Velsenbach writhing with pain in the snow. All rescue attempts foundered in the bottom of the snow beneath the Reykjavik peak. Vilo Velsenbach died at Camp 7 sometime that night. In the morning, July 13, Merkel, Gele, Angsering struggled down to the saddle on the Reykjavik Ridge, where Merkel collapsed and died. Angsering carried on alone in hopes of finding help, a gesture that was to win him the Medal of Honor of the German Red Cross. Gele, however, stood by his master, as the fond paternal version has it, and died by his side at the foot of the Mord's Head on the 15th or 16th of July, some 8 or 9 inconceivable days into the ghastly retreat. Initially, everyone in the mountaineering community joined in a general public chorus of praise for the glorious dead and the brave survivors, and you're looking at the cover of Fritz Bechtold's official expedition account of the attack at Angriff on Nanga Parbat in 1934. But privately, behind closed doors, there was an angry reckoning. The expedition was supposed to end in a glorious success, not in a glorious failure, and recrimination at once broke out between the German climbing establishment on the one hand and between the expedition leader, Vilo Merkel, and some of the lead climbers, especially the 2 Austrians, who were publicly blamed for the expedition's failure. It took a while for the dust to settle, but it was now inevitable that the Germans would return to Nanga Parbat. The homage to the dead demanded it, and return they did in 1937. The route up the mountain was familiar this time. The leader, Karl Wien, had learned from the tragic experience of 1934, and all went precisely according to plan. Up to June 11, when 7 Germans, 9 Sherpas, and 4 Baltis, and 1 Englishman, their transport liaison officer, occupied Camp 4 in a shallow declivity at 20,280 feet on the snow plateau beneath the Reykjavik peak. Camp 4. The Reykjavik peak, the arete leading up to the Silver Saddle, Nanga Parbat. 3 days of heavy snow frustrated the efforts to reach Camp 5, and all 16 men at Camp 4 were thankfully asleep in their tents on June 15 when they were overwhelmed by an avalanche of terrible proportions and instantly entombed in thousands of cubic feet of ice and snow. And just another paragraph from the book. The loss of these 16 men at 12:10 a.m. on June 15, 1937 remains to this day the single greatest disaster in the history of Himalayan mountaineering. But it was no one's fault, and unlike the 1934 disaster, it provoked no controversy or recrimination at home. If anything, 1937 stilled all controversy, and the German mountaineering community stood solidly and cooperatively behind Paul Bauer as he set out to avenge his now 11 dead countrymen. It's not even counting the many Sherpas who had died on Nanga Parbat, and two Englishmen. The British immediately granted a permit. Chalmers and Austin extended state support, and every indication is that Hitler himself now took a vengeful interest in Nanga Parbat. The problem was the climbers. They were mostly dead. But Bauer had Bechtold and Luft, a few survivors, at his disposal, and with their help quickly assembled a young but talented team of alpinists. Nursang agreed to return as head Sherpa, although most of his compatriots were understandably reluctant to accompany any Germans to Nanga Parbat, and 10 newcomers ultimately signed on. The 1938 expedition. This, by the way, is this is just a charcoal, a pencil sketch of some of the members of the 1937 expedition. It was found in the notebook of one of the climbers, Martin Pfeffer, who was buried in the avalanche in 1937. Paul Bauer, in 1938, had arranged for parachute drops of the expedition's supplies at 3 strategic locations on the mountain in hopes of accelerating the siege. As it turned out, these parachute drops were hit-or-miss affairs that usually resulted in a portentous muddle. But everything else went without a hitch, and June 1 saw the 4th German expedition to Nanga Parbat installed at base camp, where once again the weather conspired against them. And all that can really be said for the 1938 German expedition to Nanga Parbat is that it was the first German attempt in Nanga Parbat, although it didn't get very high on the mountain, from which everyone returned alive. And this was the last serious attempt on Nanga Parbat, as it turned out, before the Second World War. Although before quitting the mountain, Bauer had sent 2 climbers over to have a look at the western DMR face that Mummery had attempted in 1895. It was time, he thought, to try something more direct. The Rankiot route was simply too long and unpredictable. And in 1939, he sent, this is the 5th German expedition to Nanga Parbat. He sent a small team of Peter Aufschneider, Lutz Chicken, Heinrich Herrer, and Hans Liebenhofer back to Nanga Parbat. And after a tentative and frightening foray to 18,000 feet on Mummery's second rib, this direct line to the summit of Nanga Parbat, they retreated in the face of overwhelming technical difficulties, avalanche, and continual rockfall. Their plan then was to return in force to the DMR face in 1940, but by the time they got to Karachi in late August, war was imminent and they could not get home. Interned by the British on the outbreak of war at Dehradun in 1940, Aufschneider and Herrer later escaped to Tibet, where they remained in the service of the Dalai Lama until the Chinese invasion of 1950, the experience that lies behind Heinrich Herrer's famous memoir, 7 Years in Tibet. He got to Tibet by way of Nanga Parbat. Once again, war intervened. Not just war, but agonizing years of confusion and recovery after the Second World War. And it was not until 1953, the very moment, in fact, that the British were climbing Mount Everest successfully for the first time, the Germans returned to Nanga Parbat. By this time, as the great German post-war climber Hermann Buell would write in his book called Nanga Parbat Pilgrimage. Nanga Parbat had established itself as a symbol to conjure with in the world of mountaineers and for millions elsewhere too. That peak of many names, sometimes called the Schicksalsberg, the fateful peak, the mountain of destiny, the mountain of terror, that cloud-piercing giant which had already devoured 31 victims, that pitiless domain demanding its holocaust and giving nothing in return, luring men into its thrall, never to set them free again. But in this same Hermann Buell, in 1953, Nanga Parbat had finally met her match. He was an uncommonly individualistic climber, and the lesson of Buell's ascent of Nanga Parbat seemed to be that one man of great will and ambition could perhaps climb a mountain when 16 could not. He was one of the first to discern that one climber alone could perhaps make greater progress than a huge collaborative team. On July 3rd, 1953, defying the instructions of his leader to descend, Hermann Buell set off alone from the Silver Saddle at 2 a.m. It took him 17 hours of climbing, taking 5 breaths per step, sometimes on his hands and knees. But at 7 p.m. on July 3rd, in what remains a remarkable feat of solo climbing, Hermann Buell reached the summit of Nanga Parbat, where he built a small cairn, took some photographs, and drove his ice axe into the mountaintop as evidence of his successful climb. German newspapers, eager for any sort of vindicating triumph of the Federal Republic, insistently reported that he had left the flag, the new German flag of the Federal Republic, atop the mountain. But in truth, he had not. He had not even brought one along. What he left behind was the Tyrolean flag, the flag of his home region, and, though you don't see it here, the flag of now the independent nation-state of Pakistan. His own nationality meant nothing to him. Hermann Buell climbed for himself, and with his ascent of Nanga Parbat in 1953, as an individual, not as a representative of a nation, as a man of great determination and will, and not the expression of an ethos forged in defeat and war's experience. With his ascent of Nanga Parbat, the first successful ascent of Nanga Parbat, a new era in the history of Himalayan mountaineering had opened. Or so at least we claim in the book. Thank you very much. Photo of Nanga Parbat there to leave you with the rakiya face of Nanga Parbat from the north. I don't know if I've left any time. Who's the timekeeper? Is there any time for a question or two? Got time? You have to answer any questions, or listen to any comments, or corrections for that matter. Germans on Nanga Parbat, please.
Yes, sir. How did you obtain the original photographs of early mountaineering?
I wish I could say I found them buried in some trunk of a long abandoned archive at the Alpine Club in Munich. And in fact, my research for this book did take me to the Alpine Club in Munich, and I did hold in my hands the diaries, the Tagebuch, the day diaries of the 1937 climbers who were entombed under that appalling avalanche under the Rakiya Peak. So I did hold such things in my hand, but most of these images are readily available in photographic expedition accounts of these expeditions, and in most cases I've just scanned them. Some of them I've just scanned. Others that we reproduced in the book, you can't do that, it's illegal, it violates copyright. And so I wrote to the German Alpine Club in Munich. They hold the original native stock of most of these images, and for a hefty sum, they will send you fresh prints of these images for some are a little, some stolen. Please. I have not gone to Nanga Parbat. I've been to many parts of the Himalayan range. I haven't gone to Nanga Parbat. I very much want to, but these days is kind of a dangerous place to go. It always was, and it still is now. It's an unsettled region. And a part of disputed Kashmir where the Indian and Pakistani armies are both very active.
So was it more, I mean, it sounded like there was just a lot of bad luck. I mean, you be at a camp that's not particularly high, and a giant avalanche comes down and wipes out the entire climbers. I mean, it's just bad luck, right?
They did have a lot of bad luck, and so that Mountain of Destiny, Schicksalsberg, it kind of has a double edge to it. This was the place where the Germans were to demonstrate their audacity, their daring, their national mettle, their bravery. This was what they were destined to do. On the other hand, this was also the mountain of just sort of bad luck, bad fate, bad destiny, where they were repeatedly overwhelmed. But it's also bad planning. And this is not any longer a route by which climbers climb Nanga Parbat. It's too long. It takes too long. It's too roundabout. And had they had the technical skill, or had they had the equipment, they would have figured out shorter routes. As indeed Paul Bauer figured out by 1938-39 when he started sending reconnaissance back to the Diamar face where Mummery had tried to climb it in the first place in 1895.
Do we see that route?
Sorry?
Do we see that route in this picture? Mummery's route?
No, you can't see that at all. It's completely on the other side. Of the mountain. It's completely on the other side of the mountain. If you were to cross over this ridge, you would get into the Diamar Valley or the Diamar Glacier, and the face of the mountain, which is behind what you see here, is the Diamar face of the mountain. But this is the route by which Hermann Buell would successfully climb the mountain in 1953. So yeah, they had bad luck. They were spending too much time on the mountain. One thing that Himalayan climbers have learned: if you hang out there too long, you're going to have bad luck. You have to get in, you have to get up, you have to get down. With the speed that right acclimatization permits. Please.
In the sequence of the conquest of 8,000 meter peaks, where does Nanga Parbat lie?
Second. In fact, well, Hermann Buell was hanging out somewhere here in Camp 3 or Camp 4 in 1953 when runners came up with bringing to him the news that Hillary and Tenzing had climbed Everest. So he was already halfway up Nanga Parbat when he heard the word. And in fact, he had a can of very beer with him. And he says in Nanga Parbat pilgrimage that he toasted Hillary and Tenzing's success on Everest with a swig of his Municher beer.
These attempts to climb in the Himalayas, they seem to favor, the climb seem to favor the spring and summer. Is the chance of avalanches greater in that time of year than say it would be in the fall and winter?
They don't really favor the summer. They do favor the spring, or sometimes they favor the fall. The monsoon, the Indian Ocean monsoon, usually strikes the Himalayan rampart sometime in June or July. The British expeditions in the 20s on Everest were repeatedly there too late, and they were caught in the monsoon. Nanga Parbat is a somewhat different case, however, because of where it is. Here's Everest in the eastern Himalaya. The monsoon comes up from the Indian Ocean and it strikes the eastern Himalaya first, in early to mid-June sometimes. Nanga Parbat is actually spared the full force of the monsoon because it's so far to the north and west. The monsoon has dropped most of its moisture by the time it gets to central Nepal or Garhwal Kumaon here on Nanda Devi. The Tibetan Plateau, of course, is completely arid. It's the world's highest desert because the Himalayan rampart traps all the monsoon moisture. Nanga Parbat is relatively dry, which is, its name is the naked mountain. In some seasons, the rock is quite exposed because it receives less moisture than the rest of the range. So the climbing season there is longer. But they favor the summer more on Nanga Parbat than they do these eastern mountains where they really can't climb in the summer. They have to be done by May. Everyone climbs Everest. These horrible disasters that happen on Everest now because, again, the mountain is too crowded. They're usually happening in May. They're trying to get out of there by the end of May. Okay? Last one.
I didn't hear you mention anything about the use of oxygen tanks by the time.
No. Well, they were using it on Everest. And in fact, the British have been using it experimentally on Everest since the 1920s. And the very same week, as I just said, that Hermann Buhl was climbing Nanga Parbat in 1953, Hillary and Tenzing were climbing Everest with supplemental oxygen. But Hermann Buhl was climbing Nanga Parbat without it. Now, it's 26,000 feet. Everest is 29,000. Well, it's 26, almost 27. It's 26,600. Everest is 29,35. So Everest is 3,000 feet, something like that, higher. And that will make a difference. But also, it's funny, you know, early on, the British derided the Germans for unsporting methods. The piton, the carabiner, the crampon, they thought that was all unfair. The Daniel Whack school of mountaineering, there was no way to climb a mountain. And yet it was the British who first took to using supplemental oxygen, and the Germans, a German like Hermann Buhl, would have regarded that as unsporting, would have regarded that as unfair. That was no way to climb a mountain. And German climbers have maintained that tradition. And the great Austrian, not technically German, but the great Austrian Tyrolean climber, Reinhold Messner, who was the first man to climb Everest and Annapurna and Dhaulagiri and many other Himalayan peaks, did so without supplemental oxygen. It's kind of a German-Austrian point of pride. Please.
How does this mountain compare with Mount Elbrus that a German mountain division climbed in August of 42 in the Caucasus in the Russian front?
Very tough mountain. I don't know as much about that mountain. I don't know as much about the Caucasus Mountains. But all the German climbers, many of the German climbers who were on Nanga Parbat had really cut their teeth in high altitude mountaineering in the Caucasus. So they'd all been on Elbrus or other great Caucasian peaks. But how does it compare? It's a lot bigger than that. So, you know, it's 1 degree up. You go from Mont Blanc, the highest mountain in the Alps, which is 15,000 feet. You get into the Caucasus, where you start finding 18 to 20,000 foot mountains. You get into the Himalaya, where you start finding 27 to 29,000 foot mountains. They're bigger. And the thing about Nanga Parbat, and I showed you some of the images of it, is because of where it is, it's right here. This is the Indus River. The Indus River, which rises here on the Tibetan Plateau, bends around Nanga Parbat, makes its way to the great port of Karachi in Pakistan. This defines, in geological terms, the Himalayan syntaxis. This is the Indo-tectonic suture right here. So Nanga Parbat, the Indus River here is only about 2,000 feet above sea level. So Nanga Parbat is rising to 26,661 feet from sort of a base level, not many miles away from the summit of the Indus River Valley, at 2,000 feet. It's a 20,000 foot vertical rise over almost no distance. Everest rises to 29,000 feet, but it rises from a base of 17,000 feet. So if you're talking in real terms, this is why people can climb Everest, and do in great numbers. Very few people still can climb Nanga Parbat. All right? It is, I was told 8:45, right? And it's about 8:45. Thank you.